The ancient mountains of Aldris had always been home to the great dragons. For thousands of years, these magnificent creatures soared through the misty peaks, their scales gleaming like precious jewels under the pale northern sun. The people of the valley below knew them well, though they rarely saw them up close. The dragons were not the fire-breathing monsters of old tales, but rather gentle giants who fed on the magical crystals that grew deep within the mountain caves. Saren was the eldest of the dragon clan, her silver scales now dulled with age, her once powerful wings requiring more effort to carry her massive form through the sky. She had lived for over 2,000 years and had seen the world change in ways both wonderful and terrible. Beside her lived her mate, Karath, whose deep blue scales had begun to fade to gray. Their 3 children had grown and found their own territories, leaving the aging pair to tend to the sacred crystal gardens that their ancestors had cultivated for millennia. The crystal gardens were more than just food sources. They were the heart of dragon civilization, glowing chambers deep within the mountain where rare gemstones grew like flowers, fed by underground springs that carried magic from the Earth's core. Each crystal took decades to mature, and the dragons harvested them carefully, never taking more than the mountain could give. It was a delicate balance that had sustained their kind for countless generations. But something was wrong. Saren had noticed it first during the autumn harvest. The crystals were growing smaller, their light dimmer. Where once a single cave might yield enough magical sustenance to feed a dragon for a month, now it barely provided enough for a week. She had mentioned her concerns to Karath, but he had dismissed them as the worries of old age. Dragons lived so long that they often imagined problems where none existed, he said. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it the harshest cold the mountains had seen in centuries. The underground springs that fed the crystal gardens began to freeze, something that had never happened before. The magical energy that flowed through the mountain's veins slowed to a trickle, and, with it, the crystals stopped growing entirely. What had been a gradual decline became a crisis almost overnight. The first to feel the effects was their youngest son, Thale. He lived in the northern peaks, where the cold struck first and hardest. When he arrived at his parents' cave, weak from hunger and exhaustion, Saren knew their worst fears had come true. His golden scales, once brilliant as sunlight, had dulled to the color of old brass. His eyes, usually bright with the inner fire that all dragons possessed, were dim and unfocused. "The gardens are dead," he told them, his voice barely a whisper. "I've searched every cave in my territory. The crystals have turned to dust. There's nothing left." Karath refused to believe it at first. He flew to the great crystal chamber that had been his family's primary source of sustenance for over 1,000 years. What he found there broke something inside him. The towering formations of amethyst and quartz, once pulsing with magical light, stood dark and lifeless. When he touched one of the smaller crystals, it crumbled to powder in his claws. The news spread quickly through the dragon territories. One by one, the ancient families reported the same devastating truth. The crystal gardens were dying everywhere. Some dragons tried to fly to distant lands, seeking new sources of magical energy, but the youngest and oldest among them were already too weak to make such journeys. They began to gather in the central valley, seeking comfort in numbers, but also facing the terrible reality that they might be witnessing the end of their species. Saren's heart ached as she watched her people suffer. Dragons had always been proud creatures, but now she saw them reduced to shadows of their former selves. They spent their days huddled together for warmth, their great forms barely moving. The younger ones cried out in hunger, while the elders spoke in whispers of ancient prophecies that foretold such a time of darkness. The morning songs began on the night of the winter solstice. Traditional dragon funerals were celebrations of a life well lived, with great flights and displays of fire and light. But this was different. This was a lament for an entire species facing extinction. The songs echoed through the mountains, deep and sorrowful, carrying on the wind for miles. Even the humans in the distant villages could hear them, though they did not understand what they meant. Saren found herself thinking of the old stories her grandmother had told her when she was barely large enough to leave the nest. Tales of the first dragons, who had come to these mountains when the world was young and wild. They had made a pact with the mountain itself, promising to protect its secrets in exchange for the magical sustenance they needed to survive. Had they somehow broken that ancient covenant? Was this suffering punishment for some forgotten transgression? As the days grew shorter and the cold more bitter, the dragon's condition worsened. Korath could no longer fly, his massive wings too weak to lift him from the ground. Their daughter Lyra, who had always been the strongest of their children, arrived barely able to walk. She collapsed at the entrance to their cave, her emerald scales now dull as old leaves. Saren used what little strength she had left to help her daughter inside, but she knew they were all running out of time. The worst part was the silence. Dragons had always been creatures of few words, communicating as much through gesture and the subtle changes in their scale colors as through speech. But now, even that limited communication was fading. They lay in their caves, saving every bit of energy, speaking only when absolutely necessary. The vibrant community that had existed for thousands of years was becoming a collection of dying shadows. Yet Saren refused to give up hope entirely. Deep in her ancient heart, she held on to a memory from her youngest days. Her great-grandmother had once spoken of a time when dragons and humans had worked together before the two species had grown apart and wary of each other. In those days, humans had possessed their own kind of magic, different from the dragon's crystal-based power, but no less real. Perhaps, if such cooperation was possible once, it could be possible again. The thought seemed foolish, even desperate. Humans lived such brief lives, like flowers that bloomed and died in a single season. How could such short-lived creatures understand the deep magic that sustained dragons? And yet, as Saren looked around at her dying people, she realized that desperation might be their only remaining option. She shared her thoughts with the other elders, but they were not encouraging. Dragons and humans had not worked together for over 500 years. The last attempts at cooperation had ended in misunderstanding and mistrust on both sides. Humans feared dragons' power, while dragons found humans too unpredictable and quick to anger. The two species had learned to coexist by simply avoiding each other. But as the winter deepened and more dragons grew too weak to hunt for the few remaining crystal fragments, Saren began to wonder if their ancient pride was worth more than their survival. She had seen civilizations rise and fall during her long life. She had watched forests grow from seedlings to mighty woodlands, only to be cleared by human settlements. She had seen mountains carved into new shapes by time and weather. Perhaps it was simply time for dragons to adapt or perish. The decision came to her on a night when the morning songs were particularly sorrowful. 3 more dragons had passed into the final sleep that day, their bodies simply too depleted to continue. Among them was old Garrett, who had been Saren's childhood friend and had lived for nearly as long as she had. As she listened to the laments echoing through the valley, she made a choice that would have seemed impossible just months before. She would seek help from the humans, not as a proud dragon demanding tribute, but as a desperate mother begging for aid to save her children. It went against everything she had been taught about dragon dignity and independence, but watching her people slowly fade away had stripped such concerns down to their meaningless core. Dignity meant nothing if there was no one left alive to remember it. The other dragons were too weak to argue when she announced her intention. Some seemed relieved that someone was finally willing to take action, while others simply lacked the energy to care. Korath, her beloved mate of over 1,000 years, could barely lift his great head when she told him goodbye. His eyes still held a spark of the fierce intelligence that had first attracted her to him, but his body was failing rapidly. "If this foolishness kills you," he whispered, "I will follow soon after anyway." Saren touched her snout gently to his, sharing what little warmth she had left. Then, let me try to give you a reason to keep living. The flight down from the mountains was the most difficult of her long life. Where once she could have covered the distance to the human settlements in a matter of hours, now it took her an entire day, with frequent rests on rocky ledges. Her wings, which had carried her through countless storms and adventures, felt like lead weights dragging her down. Only the thought of her dying people gave her the strength to continue. As she flew, she tried to remember what she knew about humans. They were builders and makers, constantly creating new things and tearing down old ones. They worked with metal and stone, growing their settlements like crystals, but without the patience to let them develop naturally. They lived in groups like dragons did, but their groups were much larger and more chaotic. Most importantly, at least according to the old stories, they had once possessed a magic of their own. The human settlement she approached was larger than she had expected. Where her memories suggested a small village of wooden huts, she found a town of stone buildings with smoke rising from dozens of chimneys. Lights flickered in windows, and she could see people moving about in the streets below, bundled against the winter cold. It looked busy and alive in a way that made her think of her own people in healthier times. Landing at the edge of the town was perhaps the most frightening thing she had ever done. Not because she feared the humans would attack her, though that was certainly a possibility, but because it represented such a complete abandonment of everything dragons stood for. Her people were proud and self-sufficient. They did not beg. They did not show weakness to outsiders. Yet here she was, preparing to do both. The humans noticed her immediately, of course. It would have been impossible for them to miss a creature of her size landing so close to their homes. She heard shouts and calls, saw people running and pointing. Some seemed to be gathering weapons, while others appeared to be fleeing. The chaos of human reaction was exactly what she had expected, but it still made her nervous. Then, through the crowd of frightened and excited people, she saw something that gave her the first real hope she had felt in months. A small figure was walking toward her through the snow, moving with purpose while everyone else seemed frozen by indecision. As the figure came closer, she could see it was a young human, barely more than a child by their standards, wrapped in a thick winter coat, but showing no sign of fear. The child stopped just a few feet away from her massive head and looked up at her with curious, intelligent eyes. There was something in that gaze that reminded Saren of her own children when they were young, a sense of wonder mixed with careful assessment. This small human was studying her the same way a young dragon might study a new crystal formation, trying to understand its properties and potential. "You're hurt," the child said simply, and Saren realized that her desperation must be visible even to these short-lived creatures. "Are you here for help?" The child who stood before Saren was named Maya, though the dragon would not learn this until much later. What struck Saren immediately was not just the child's lack of fear, but the strange warmth that seemed to radiate from her small form. Even in the bitter winter cold, with snow falling steadily around them, Maya appeared comfortable and relaxed. Her cheeks were rosy with health, not pinched with cold like the other humans who were still keeping their distance. "Yes," Saren replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Speaking took so much effort now, and she had to choose her words carefully. "My people are dying. Our food source has been destroyed by the cold. We need help." The admission felt like swallowing stones, but Maya simply nodded as if dragons asking humans for assistance was the most natural thing in the world. She turned and spoke to the other humans in their rapid, musical language. Saren had learned to understand human speech during her long life, but speaking it was more difficult. The sounds felt awkward in her throat, designed as it was for the deeper, more resonant tones of dragon communication. What followed was unlike anything Saren had expected. Instead of demands for tribute or displays of power, instead of fear or hostility, the humans began to organize themselves with surprising efficiency. Maya seemed to be translating Saren's words, and soon people were hurrying off in different directions. Some went into buildings and emerged with blankets and tools. Others gathered around what appeared to be their leader, an older man with silver hair and kind eyes. The man approached carefully, his hands held open and empty in a gesture that Saren recognized as peaceful. "I am Thomas, the mayor of Winterhaven," he said clearly. "This child says your people are starving. Tell us what you need." Saren explained about the crystal gardens as best she could. She described how the magical stones provided sustenance for dragons, and how the unprecedented cold had killed the underground springs that fed them. She spoke of the dozens of dragons now too weak to fly, slowly dying in the caves high above. As she talked, she watched the humans' faces carefully, looking for signs of disbelief or mockery. Instead, she saw something she had not expected: understanding. These humans knew about harsh winters and failed crops. They understood what it meant to watch loved ones suffer from hunger. When she finished speaking, Thomas was quiet for a long moment, clearly thinking hard about what he had heard. "The magical crystals," he said finally, "are they similar to the stones our ancestors used to call hearthstones? The ones that could provide warmth and light?" Saren felt her heart leap. "You know of such things?" "Old stories, mostly," Thomas admitted. "But my grandmother used to speak of a time when our people could coax magic from certain stones. That knowledge was lost generations ago, when the last of the old magic users died without passing on their skills." Maya stepped forward again, pulling something from beneath her coat. It was a small, rough stone that glowed with a faint inner light. "Like this?" she asked, holding it up. The moment Saren saw the stone, she knew what it was. Not a dragon crystal, but something closely related. The magical energy radiating from it was different from what she was used to, warmer, more chaotic, but definitely real. "Where did you find that?" "I made it," Maya said simply. "Well, not made exactly. I found the stone in the old mine, and I sort of asked it to wake up. It started glowing a few days ago." The other humans looked as surprised as Saren felt. Clearly, Maya had not shared this development with anyone else. Thomas knelt down beside the child, examining the glowing stone with wonder and concern in equal measure. "Maya, why didn't you tell us about this?" The child shrugged, suddenly, looking very young despite her earlier composure. "I thought everyone could do it. I thought I was just slow to figure it out." Saren studied the child more carefully. Now that she knew what to look for, she could see the subtle signs of magical ability that she had missed before. The way the falling snow seemed to avoid Maya's face, the slight shimmer in the air around her hands, the complete lack of concern about the winter cold. This human child was a natural magic user, possibly the first her people had produced in several generations. "Maya," Saren said carefully, "would you be willing to try something? I want to see if you can do with my kind of stones what you did with yours." The child looked to Thomas, who nodded slowly. Maya approached Saren's massive form without hesitation, and the dragon carefully extended one of her claws. Nestled in it was a small fragment of crystal, one of the last pieces she had brought with her. It was dark and lifeless, but it still held the potential for magical energy. Maya took the crystal fragment gently, cradling it in her small hands. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, gradually, a faint light began to appear within the stone. It was different from a steady glow Saren remembered from healthy crystals, more flickering and uncertain, but it was definitely there. "It's like there's something sleeping inside," Maya said, her voice filled with concentration. "Something that wants to wake up, but doesn't know how." "Can you help it?" Saren asked, hardly daring to hope. Maya closed her eyes and held the crystal close to her chest. The light within it grew stronger, pulsing in rhythm with the child's heartbeat. When she opened her eyes again, the crystal was glowing with about half the intensity of a healthy dragon stone. The surge of energy that hit Saren was like a drink of cool water after days in the desert. It was not enough to restore her fully, but it was enough to prove that restoration was possible. For the first time in months, she felt genuine hope. "Incredible," Thomas breathed. "Maya, Do you understand what you just did? But Maya was already thinking ahead to the larger problem. There are lots of dragons who need help, right? She asked Saren. And probably lots of crystals that need to be woken up. Dozens of dragons, Saren confirmed. And thousands of crystals. The child considered this seriously. I don't think I can do it all by myself. But maybe I can teach other people? If I can figure it out, maybe others can too. What followed was perhaps the strangest planning session in the history of either species. Dragons had always made decisions slowly and carefully, considering every possible outcome before taking action. Humans, as Saren quickly learned, prefer to make decisions quickly and adjust their plans as they went along. The combination was chaotic, but surprisingly effective. Thomas organized teams of volunteers to help transport supplies up to the dragon territories. Maya worked with the town's children, trying to teach them the techniques she had discovered for awakening dormant magical stones. Saren served as an advisor and translator, helping the humans understand the specific needs of dragon physiology and the particular properties of crystal magic. Not every human child could learn Maya's techniques. Magic, it seemed, required a particular type of personality, one that was open to possibilities and unafraid of the unknown. But out of the 30 children in Winter Haven, 7 showed real promise, and 3 became genuinely skilled at crystal awakening. The first relief expedition set out on the morning after Saren's arrival. She flew ahead, carrying supplies and several of the magic-gifted children, while Thomas led a team of adults on foot with sleds full of food and medical supplies. The journey up to the Dragon Caves was treacherous, but the humans proved surprisingly hardy and determined. When they reached the central valley where most of the dragons had gathered, Saren was shocked by how much her people had deteriorated in just the few days she had been gone. Several more had passed in a final sleep, and those who remained were barely clinging to life. Karath was so weak he could not lift his head when she landed beside him. But Maya and the other children went to work immediately. They moved from dragon to dragon, gently awakening whatever crystal fragments could be found and providing just enough magical energy to stabilize the dying creatures. It was exhausting work. The children had to rest frequently, and the crystals they produced were nowhere near as potent as the originals had been. However, it was enough. For the first time in months, no dragons died that day. The improvement was gradual but noticeable. Scales began to regain some of their luster. Eyes grew brighter. The youngest dragons even managed to lift their heads and take some interest in their surroundings. The work continued for days. The humans established a camp in the valley, setting up tents and cooking fires that provided warmth for both species. Children worked in shifts, awakening crystals and teaching dragon youngsters the techniques they were learning. Adults tended to the weakest dragons, providing food and medicine that helped restore their strength. Saren found herself working closely with Thomas, coordinating the relief efforts and solving the countless small problems that arose when 2 very different species tried to cooperate. She learned that humans were far more adaptable than she had imagined, and that their short lives had given them a sense of urgency that could be remarkably effective when properly directed. Thomas, for his part, was amazed by the depth of dragon knowledge and the careful way they approach problems. "You think about consequences we never even consider," he told Saren during one of their planning sessions. "Some of your people have been alive longer than our entire town's history. That kind of perspective is invaluable." But the most remarkable relationship was the one developing between Maya and the younger dragons. The child seemed to have a natural gift for communicating with them, understanding their needs and fears in ways that even surprised Saren. Maya spent hours each day working with dragon children, teaching them how to sense magical energy and helping them understand what had happened to their traditional food sources. One evening, as Saren watched Maya playing some sort of complicated game with 3 young dragons, she realized that something historic was taking place. Not just the saving of her people, though that was miraculous enough, but the building of bridges between two species that have been isolated from each other for centuries. She's teaching them to think like humans, Korath observed. He was much stronger now, able to sit up and take an active interest in what was happening around him. And they're teaching her to think like dragons. I wonder what kind of magic might come from that combination. Saren pondered this as she watched the children, human and dragon alike, working together with an ease that their elders found difficult to match. Perhaps the solution to their crisis was not just about finding new sources of magical energy. Perhaps it was about finding new ways of thinking about magic altogether. The breakthrough came 2 weeks into the relief effort. Maya was working with a young dragon named Pip, trying to help him understand how to awakening crystal fragments on his own. Dragons had never been able to manipulate magical energy the way humans could. They had always simply absorbed it from natural sources. But as Maya patiently explained her techniques, something clicked. Pip managed not just to awaken a crystal fragment, but to actually improve upon Maya's work. The stone he touched blazed with light that was almost as bright as the original dragon crystals had been. More importantly, the energy it contained felt more stable and long-lasting than the human-awakened stones. "How'd you do that?" Maya asked, her eyes wide with amazement. Pip struggled to explain. "I did what you taught me, but then I also did what my grandmother taught me about listening to stones. I heard what the crystal wanted to be, and I helped it become that." This was the moment when both species realized they were on the verge of something unprecedented. Maya's human intuition for awakening magical potential, combined with Pip's dragon understanding of crystal nature, had produced something neither species could achieve alone. The techniques they developed together over the following days would prove to be the foundation for a new kind of magic, one that was stronger and more sustainable than anything either humans or dragons had known before. The transformation of the mountain valley over the following months was nothing short of miraculous. What had begun as a desperate rescue mission evolved into something that neither species had ever imagined possible, a true partnership between dragons and humans that brought out the best qualities of both peoples. Maya and Pip became the first official teachers of what they called bridge magic, magical techniques that combined human intuition with dragon wisdom. Their success inspired other children from both species to experiment with cross-cultural magical learning. Soon, small groups of young humans and dragons were working together throughout the valley, sharing techniques and discoveries that amazed their elders. The crystal gardens began to flourish again, but in ways that surpassed their original glory. The new awakening techniques did not just restore dormant crystals, they actually improved them. Stones that had once provided sustenance for a single dragon now contained enough energy for 3 or 4. More importantly, the awakened crystals seemed to be self-sustaining, drawing energy from sources that the traditional methods had never been able to access. Saren spent much of her time documenting these developments, working with Thomas to create detailed records that both species could study and learn from. They discovered that the crisis had actually been building for centuries as the old methods of crystal cultivation became less and less effective. The harsh winter had simply been the final trigger that made the gradual decline impossible to ignore. Our ancestors knew something we forgot, Thomas observed one evening as they reviewed the day's discoveries. The old stories speak of humans and dragons working together to maintain the magical balance of the mountains. Somewhere along the way, we convinced ourselves we were better off alone. The practical challenges of creating an integrated community were enormous. Dragons and humans had very different needs when it came to shelter, food, and social organization. But the children on both sides seemed to adapt much more easily than the adults, finding creative solutions that their parents would never have considered. Young dragons learned to appreciate the warmth and coziness of human-style shelters, while human children discovered the thrill of sleeping under the open sky in the manner of dragons. They shared meals, combining dragon knowledge of which plants had magical properties with human skills in cooking and preparation. They developed games that could be played by creatures of vastly different sizes and abilities. Maya emerged as a natural leader among the children, but she was careful to include both species in every decision. She had learned from Pip the dragon value of careful consideration, while teaching him the human skill of quick adaptation when circumstances changed. Together, they formed a leadership partnership that became a model for adult cooperation. The adults were slower to adapt, but they learned from their children's example. Saren found herself working closely with human craftsmen, helping them understand the geological forces that shaped crystal growth. Human engineers studied dragon architecture, learning how to build structures that could withstand the mountain's harsh weather while remaining beautiful and harmonious with the natural environment. One of the most significant developments was the establishment of the Council of Voices, a governing body that included both dragons and humans with equal representation from both species. The council met weekly to address the practical challenges of their growing community and to plan for their shared future. The council's first major decision was to establish formal protection for the Crystal Gardens. Under the new agreements, both species committed to sustainable harvesting practices that would ensure the magical stones could continue to regenerate indefinitely. They also created detailed maps and guidelines that would prevent the kind of overharvesting that had contributed to the original crisis. But, perhaps more importantly, the council began planning for the long-term education of both species. Schools were established where human and dragon children could learn together, studying both the magical arts and the practical skills needed to maintain their mountain community. Adult education programs allowed older members of both species to learn new techniques and perspectives. Maya's parents had been hesitant about their daughter's involvement with the dragons at first, worried about her safety and the time she was spending away from human traditions. But as they saw how much she was learning and how happy she had become, they began to understand the value of what was happening in the mountains. "She's not just learning magic," her mother told Thomas one day. "She's learning to see the world from perspectives we never could have taught her. She understands patience from the dragons, but she's also teaching them about innovation and quick thinking. It's making her into someone I never could have imagined." The changes were not without challenges. Some dragons, particularly among the older generation, remained suspicious of human involvement in their affairs. They worried about the loss of traditional dragon culture and the potential for human unpredictability to disrupt their ancient ways of life. Similarly, some humans in the valley below remained fearful of the dragons, despite the obvious benefits of the partnership. Old prejudices and misunderstandings died hard, and there were incidents where fear and ignorance led to conflicts that the council had to work carefully to resolve. But the successes far outweighed the difficulties. As winter gave way to spring, the mountain valley burst into life in ways that amazed everyone. The Crystal Gardens were not only restored, but were producing more magical energy than anyone had seen in living memory. The techniques developed by Maya, Pip, and their fellow students had created a sustainable system that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. More importantly, both species were discovering capabilities they had never known they possessed. Dragons were learning to work with their hands and minds in new ways, creating art and inventions that combined their natural patience with human creativity. Humans were developing magical abilities that had been dormant for generations, awakening powers their ancestors had possessed, but which had been lost to time and disuse. The transformation was not limited to magic and technology. Both species were changing in fundamental ways. Dragons were becoming more flexible and adaptable, while humans were learning the value of careful thought and long-term planning. The children especially showed signs of developing capabilities that neither species had ever possessed alone. Maya and Pip remained at the center of these developments, but they were no longer unique. Dozens of human-dragon partnerships had formed among the young people, each one exploring different aspects of bridge magic and cross-cultural cooperation. Some focused on healing arts, others on environmental management, still others on the creation of new forms of art and music. One of the most remarkable developments was the emergence of new forms of communication. Traditional dragon speech was slow and formal, while human communication was quick but often imprecise. The children developed hybrid forms of expression that combined the clarity of dragon communication with the flexibility of human language. They could convey complex magical concepts with unprecedented precision, while still maintaining the emotional warmth that made their conversations engaging and personal. As summer arrived, delegations began arriving from other dragon territories and human settlements. Word of the miraculous partnership in Valdris had spread, and leaders from both species wanted to see for themselves what had been accomplished. Some came seeking help with their own magical crises, while others simply wanted to understand how such unlikely cooperation had been achieved. Saren found herself serving as an ambassador and teacher, sharing the lessons she had learned about cross-cultural cooperation. She was amazed by how much her own perspective had changed during the months of working with humans. Where she had once seen their short lives as a weakness, she now understood it as a source of urgency and innovation that could balance dragon caution and deliberation. Thomas, meanwhile, was documenting everything for future generations. He had begun writing a comprehensive history of the partnership, interviewing participants from both species and recording the discoveries that had saved the dragons and revolutionized both communities. He knew that what they had accomplished was unprecedented and wanted to ensure that the knowledge would not be lost. The arrival of visitors also brought new challenges. Some dragons from traditional territories were scandalized by what they saw as abandonment of proper dragon behavior. Some human settlements were afraid that cooperation with dragons would somehow diminish human independence or lead to domination by the larger, longer-lived creatures. Maya and Pip took leading roles in addressing these concerns, serving as living examples of how human-dragon cooperation could benefit both species without threatening their distinct identities. They demonstrated bridge magic techniques, showed off the restored crystal gardens, and patiently explained how the partnership had developed gradually through mutual respect and shared learning. Their most powerful arguments, however, were the visible results of their cooperation. The valley was thriving as never before. Both species were healthier, more capable, and happier than they had been before the crisis. The children especially were developing in ways that amazed their elders, showing capabilities that seemed to represent the best qualities of both dragons and humans. By autumn, formal treaties had been signed between Valdris and 3 other dragon territories, as well as 5 human settlements. The agreements established frameworks for cooperation, trade, and mutual assistance that could serve as models for other communities. They also created networks for sharing the new magical techniques and educational methods that had been developed. The anniversary of Saren's desperate flight to seek human help was marked by a great celebration that included both species and visitors from across the region. The festival featured demonstrations of bridge magic, displays of cooperative art, and music, and formal recognition of the pioneers who had made the partnership possible. Maya and Pip were honored as the first bridge mages, but they insisted that the real credit belonged to everyone who had been willing to set aside old prejudices and work together for the common good. Saren was recognized as the dragon whose courage had made the partnership possible, while Thomas was celebrated for his leadership in organizing the human response to the crisis. But perhaps the most moving moment of the celebration came when Karath, now fully recovered and stronger than he had been in decades, spoke about what the partnership had meant to the dragons. "We thought our story was ending," he said, his deep voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. "We believed that our time in this world was finished. But instead, we discovered that our story was just beginning a new chapter." As winter approached again, the community faced the season with confidence rather than fear. The crystal gardens were strong and sustainable. Both species had learned new skills and developed new capabilities. Most importantly, they had created something that neither could have achieved alone. A true partnership that honored the strengths of both while building something greater than either. Maya and Pip, now recognized as Master Bridge mages despite their young age, had begun training the next generation of cross-cultural magical practitioners. Their students came from across the region, young dragons and humans who wanted to learn the techniques that had saved the mountain community and created such unprecedented cooperation. The lessons learned in Valdris were spreading far beyond the mountain valley. Reports arrived regularly of other communities attempting similar partnerships, with varying degrees of success. Some failed due to old prejudices or a lack of patience. Others succeeded brilliantly, developing their own unique approaches to human-dragon cooperation. Saren often found herself reflecting on how much had changed since that desperate night when she had first flown down from the mountains to seek human help. What had begun as a crisis that threatened to destroy her people had instead become the foundation for a new era of cooperation and prosperity. The morning songs of the dragons had been replaced by new melodies that celebrated partnership and hope. The humans had discovered that their ancient magical heritage was not lost, but simply sleeping, waiting for the right circumstances to awaken. Together, they had created something unprecedented in the history of either species, a sustainable, thriving community that honored the past while embracing the future. As she watched Maya and Pip working together on their latest magical discovery, Saren smiled in the way that dragons do when they are deeply content. The ravenous dragons no longer mourned, for their hunger had been satisfied not just with food, but with purpose, community, and hope. The human in the snow had indeed brought unexpected salvation, but more than that, she had brought the gift of understanding that some challenges can only be overcome when former strangers become true partners.